The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel.
And I'm Yalda Hakim.
And we're the top international correspondents at NBC News and Sky News. And we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yalda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, good morning, and welcome to Morning Politics with Sam and Anne, the podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes, even when you've been up very late the night before. Now, before we go any further, two things, if you'll indulge me. First of all, let me give a shameless plug to colleague and friend Sophie Ridge for winning Royal Television Society Presenter of the Year at the TV Olympics last night. I am impossibly proud and pleased of you. Well done, you. And secondly, to all of those doubters at the bar in the early hours who asked the question, I say to you, it was never in doubt. I'm here. I made it. Up at the normal time, I've read all the papers, I'm in the kitchen next to the cat. You wouldn't be able to tell, I hope. Can you, Anne?
I can't tell it all, Sam, but I'm just keeping my voice on the low side, just in case your head might be a little bit in a tender state. It's Anne McElvoy here with Sam Coates from Sky News, recovering this morning after it got quite rightly News Channel of the Year at the TV Olympics. It's Thursday, the 6th of March. And what's up, Sam, apart from you?
Right, I've been through all the papers and the news websites. If I'm being completely honest, Anne, the news gods aren't exactly smiling on domestic politics today. Overnight, the Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood tried to shut down this row over, well, it's what the Tories call two-tier justice suggestions. There are these changes to the sentencing guidelines, which could mean ethnic minority and transgender criminals are more likely to avoid jail, but she's waded in and requested a reversal of that guidance. She's apparently incandescent and didn't know about this. So provided that they are reversed, it doesn't look to me like that row, which is on some of the front pages, has a great deal more legs to go. There's an absolute belter of a story on page 2 of The Times. Yeah, that is actually right. I still get the paper copy of The Times pushed through the door every morning. And that is a story about, now get this, you might have come across Matt Wrack. For decades, he was head of the Fire Brigade Union, which, as most people who listen to this podcast, is one of the most left-wing unions that there is. Now, he actually ended up leaving the FBU, and he is now in line to become the head of one of the two biggest teaching unions. Right, here is a guy who does not have any kind of professional educational background, but he is the preferred candidate to lead the NASWT. Now, there are two unions, education unions in this country. The other one is the National Education Union, and that one's led by Daniel Kebede, who is also a figure pretty far on the left. But if Matt Wrack, who is known for really, hard as nails negotiations and an affinity for industrial action, gets that spot, I am not sure that is going to go down terribly well in the Department for Education, particularly when, to put it lightly, I think the view of the Treasury on public sector pay is that the time for plenty is certainly not upon us and maybe over. It's a little straw in the wind in some ways, Anne, but do you think if this goes ahead and actually happens and Matt Wrack does end up leading NASWT, it could actually tell us something a little bit bigger?
Yeah, it depends, I think, if it does go ahead and actually happen, or whether there's enough of a backlash from this being reported. There's a lot of members might say, well, hang on a minute, this is not a member of our profession. But I do think it's a straw in the wind in the sense of public sector pay arguments beginning to bubble up again, and following that in education for a while. It hasn't entirely got away, maybe not so much in the headlines, but the National Education Union you referred to there, the largest teaching union, intends to debate at its conference next month whether to vote for industrial action over pay. It's not happy with the government's pay agreement and wants more going forward, in particular after that 5.5% pay rise last September, and is saying, however, it does then tail off, and they're not happy about that. So that is quite possible, that strikes haven't been ruled out. And I just happened to notice that in the London Education education press. There are a few strikes around by 4 council-maintained secondary schools in Haringey over plans to increase class sizes, and teachers there through their union representative saying this doesn't align with national standards that Bridget Phillipson, the education secretary, has been so keen to say, I'm not going to drop standards. So I think there is stuff bubbling up. If Matt Wrack really did get that job, I think that pot would boil a lot faster.
Well, we will see. All of that kind of stuff is decided over the conference season for teachers, which traditionally takes place over Easter. So he could be confirmed then, or it could end up going to a vote. But we'll know in about a month and a half, whether or not that well-known figure on the left of British politics has a new job. And that would all be relatively extraordinary. Right. We have to talk about the way that global affairs is impacting stuff back at home. Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are out and about today on defence visits. You had the European Council on Defence meeting today, so you've got all the EU leaders gathering to talk about that. You've got President Macron with a big address overnight pushing this idea of a European nuclear shield, and John Healey is in Washington to talk to his counterpart about the decision by the US to pull intelligence sharing with Ukraine, which can have an almost immediate impact on their ability to be able to fire certain types of missiles. But the kind of best story across all of the papers and news websites and all the rest of it comes actually, I think, from Politico this morning, because they are reporting that senior members of Donald Trump's government have held secret talks with President Zelensky's opponents, his political opponents, including Yulia Tymoshenko, who would stand against him in any election. And what on earth is going on? And isn't this an enormous blow to the efforts of Keir Starmer, President Macron and others to try and shore up the Ukrainian president?
Yes, but I think it is also a sign that things are moving on the ground in Ukraine, even inside. It's very fragile democracy, but something that it does have is internal politics. You know, it would have a show like this in Ukraine could really go on for quite some time. So my colleague Jamie Detmer has been reporting scoopily today from Kyiv that those senior members of the Trump entourage have held discussions with opponents to Volodymyr Zelensky. And I think you reflect it when you ask the question the way you do. It does reflect a kind of personal beef, I think, between Zelensky and Trump that is not going to go away even after Zelensky, to an extent, bowed and scraped to get that sort of deal back on the table and get back into Trump's good graces. But it's pretty clear, I think, that Trump would like him gone. And really the casus belli here is about presidential elections. Now, if you are the opposition, Yulia Tymoshenko is a very ambitious person. She's been the prime minister before. She wants to come back. She's allied to a lot of opponents of Zelensky, but still on the Democratic side of the balance sheet. Of course, you're going to say, well, let's try to get to elections as quickly as possible. The view of the Zelensky team, and I have an interview, also the Power Play podcast, with Alexander Merezhko, who is chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, very strong ally of Zelensky, is that this is really dangerous. They say it's not just because they want their guy to hang on, but they say that holding elections while Russia is occupying Ukrainian territory, which is, after all, a demand. You'll remember Donald Trump, Sam went on and on about that. You know, you're not legitimate. You need to hold elections. And basically the view from Zelensky's people is, well, this is a Putin-influenced idea. It will weaken Ukraine. It will be infiltrated. But you're seeing there that when push comes to shove, America tends to come on in and add to the pressure on the existing president of Ukraine in any way they can. It's a great inside story there from our Brussels site there via Jamie Detmer.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because on the one hand, the American administration says we are not interfering in the domestic politics of Ukraine. But we have all heard Donald Trump call President Zelensky a dictator without elections. And there are people in the administration, the Trump administration, who are trying to get up and running, it seems, this completely false idea of Kyiv cancelling elections. And I think, the administration might formally say one thing to allies like the UK and behave completely differently. But it's also interesting because, as so often, you sort of wonder how the actions of the Trump administration don't really reflect the facts on the ground. Now, it seems a bit odd to say this, but there was a voting intention poll by a British pollster, Survation, earlier this week, and that suggested that even if there were elections, President Zelensky would be comfortably returned to the presidency. 44% said they'd back Zelensky for the presidency immediately, with the sort of next most favourable candidate trailing him by more than 20 percentage points. So I think in the end, it is not clear that Donald Trump would get what he wanted if he does want the end of President Zelensky, if the country was to hold elections. So the objectives, the means and the ends all seem completely disjointed here.
Well, yeah, but no, I think, because one thing we don't know is really who would be the candidate and on what terms, because you're right, it's and I do think polling at the moment in Ukraine about an election which the government doesn't want to happen. I mean, anybody who's seen that wonderful Zelensky comedy Servant of the People, I mean, there's a black comedy to this, isn't there? Like, how are you going to do it, and who is actually going to be the candidate? Oh, I know what we'll do. We'll have an opinion poll. So there is a really interesting detail here, Sam, which is that Valery Zaluzhny, the ambassador to London, basically fell out with Zelensky, who's a big figure in planning the military side of the war and strategy. They had a falling out, and he's ended up here in London. But he does have a following. He has a following in this democratic opposition. There are a lot of people would love him to come back and to sort of claim, as they see, his rightful glory from leading Ukraine militarily, at least in part of the war. So I think we don't really know what opposition to Zelensky would look like. And in fairness to Zelensky, I think he is getting tired. And I think he has said, if I can get anywhere that is a satisfactory place, I am not hanging on to power here. I could quite easily see a situation in which this leads to the departure of Zelensky. I think what his party, what he wants, is to make sure that doesn't just happen as a rout because it suits Donald Trump to show that he can push a leader out of power, but that it happens in a way that looks like an orderly transition of power in Ukraine.
I suppose if there's a sort of bigger picture point to make, it is, by this action, the Trump administration is sowing the seeds of doubt and fueling division. Division by doing this in Ukraine, division and uncertainty amongst allies, I suspect even in the UK, about domestic politics in Ukraine. As strongly as we stand with President Zelensky, this is uncomfortable to watch as Keir Starmer tries to get President Trump to stand shoulder to shoulder with President Zelensky. That looks increasingly unsuccessful. And in the extraordinary arc of the last 7 days, it felt to me like the story had been that there was chaos after last Friday lunchtime's meeting between Zelensky and President Trump, but that over the weekend, Keir Starmer and President Macron managed to calm things down, to reduce the temperature, to introduce a kind of plan. Yet here we are every day, and there are just massive areas with cracks opening up all over the place. And this feels like one of them, suggesting divisions internally in the politics of Ukraine is just sort of, it's one thing too far, I think, for allies to be able to cope with. That's a kind of segue into the other big thing going on in Europe today, which is this EU Council, the bulk of the discussion of which will focus on Europe's own defence capacities. But again, the situation here is that there are very big and difficult differences between the European sort of countries, and there are fault lines which are very much emerging. So Ursula von der Leyen today will present a plan to increase the defence capability of the EU. President Macron sort of spoke to the French people last night about that. But, you know, the difficult thing is there is a big loan package on the table pushed by the European Commission, but similar questions to the ones we've had in the UK. Should this money be restricted to European defence companies? Which types of companies should be the ones that benefit? How much resistance are you going to get from countries like Hungary? And could you end up diverting money from other things like structural funds in order to pay for defence? That's got echoes of what's happened in the UK with the aid budget going to defence. Once you get below the headline of people saying that they stand with Ukraine and Zelensky, actually getting people to change their domestic political situation, change policy and change the way they do things is going to prove very, very hard. And there are no easy answers.
I think that's right. And also, how does this mesh with the desire? A lot of European countries, particularly the UK, talks a lot about having a kind of new industrial strategy, doesn't it? You know, sort of something where you could ideally align your defence spending, which could be a lot of money. We've talked about it a lot this week, how budgets are looking for Rachel Reeves. At some point, there's going to be a gouging of budgets to pay for defence that people will notice. At the moment, they're just big figures, aren't they? They're big figures with billions in front of them. But when you notice that it's actually gone from place A to place B in terms of the national household budget, I think you will see voters be a lot more reactive about that. The question is, can you do that? You know, can you make it about jobs in the UK or as much as it is about defence? Now, there is one worked example of that, which is the Anglo-German Defence Agreement, which is a 350 million at the moment, but that's effectively almost like seed capital in defence spending, where I think both sides, John Healey really pushed that along with his German counterpart. And that's an example where that looks like German investment to do things in the UK that is a good story for a government to tell, because you're sort of getting two things done at once. But you indicated it, and it's funny, I was just thinking about this the other day. It's like, we keep hearing that the one way to get this really done at scale is to buy a lot of weapons from the US, get the US back involved that way with the security of Ukraine. And I do think there is more of a tension there than we've yet discussed it in detail, Sam, about like, well, that's sending money to the US. You know, that's not about really beefing up domestic or European production of weapons kit, etc. I think there will be an argument about that, but it's moving so fast that all of these things are perhaps a bit further down the line right now. Just need to keep that support going to Ukraine, and these things will follow.
Absolutely. I mean, look, people use their defence industries as a bit of a Union Jack, and the Americans insist, if you work with them, that you buy American. You only have to look at the nuclear deterrent. There's a great story in the Times today about just how much the Americans pull rank when it comes to our Trident nuclear deterrent. And what we can say about our own nuclear deterrent is determined by the Americans, it seems. And I think that question of whether or not you can have an industrial strategy on defence that really boosts UK defence companies is a lot more tricky than Keir Starmer and John Healey and Rachel Reeves made it look this week. But the honest truth, Anne, is that defence industrial strategy is a tiny part of what I think we're going to be talking about over the next 3 weeks in the lead up to the spring statement, which is exactly that. Public spending, savings in government department, and the queen of it all, Rachel Reeves. I think we are going to see for the first time in a few weeks a proper competition between for the sort of top news slot and a split screen between what's happening in Ukraine and President Trump on the one hand, and what's going on over in the Treasury in Horse Guards Parade on the other, because I think it's an absolutely critical period that we're entering into, and domestic politics I think is going to take back over for the next 21 days.
And I think it is going to be the moment when a conversation starts about who has to give up what has to be sacrificed in terms of Labour Party commitments before it came to office, who bears the brunt of that in terms of spending and intentions in the cabinet. And it is the moment when, once you start to put the old pounds, shillings and pence on your grand plans for the defence of Europe, I think you start a very different conversation with the electorate over the spring statement and beyond that.
But more than anything else, I think it has been an extraordinary week in global and domestic politics. And I say that in order to basically advocate that it's a time for everybody to have a lie in and a lie down, because the pace of events has just been incredible. So we will switch off for today. We will switch off for the weekend, but we will be back with all the pep, the vim and the vigour that you would expect on Monday morning for politics with Sam and I will see you then, and have a brilliant weekend.
Have a great weekend, Sam.
The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel,
And I'm Yalda Hakim.
and we're the top international correspondents at NBC News and Sky News, and we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yalda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.